So yeah, automated visual testing with Percy. I'm Mike, I'm the co-founder of Percy. I now lead visual testing at BrowserStack. Really excited to kind of bring visual testing to BrowserStack as a new kind of testing that can be done on the platform. And we're going to talk about what that means. So today we'll go through a visual testing crash course. We'll get into all the details about what does that mean? What does it kind of do for you? How is it different than things like functional testing? We'll go through a live demo, sort of show you the product a little bit. And then do a quick sort of under the hood look of like, what does actually Percy do in order to make this as a service really fast and really scalable? Some interesting tidbits about how we kind of work underneath, and then hopefully leave some good time for some Q&A. So let's just get right into it. What is visual testing? I like kind of describing this problem like this so that you have some context coming from maybe a functional testing background or that kind of thing. So you have lots of automation, lots of functional tests often, lots of processes to make sure that you're launching things with some confidence. But how are you supposed to test this? It may even take you a second to know what I mean when I say this, right? So I'm talking about this if you look close enough. Something happened here, right? Like this is clearly a button, but there's no text on it. Maybe there is text on it, but the text is green or it's hidden by some CSS. So obviously you and I can look at this and say, that's a visual bug, right? But how am I supposed to test for that in an automated way? That's the question that kind of underlies visual testing. And it goes a lot deeper than that, of course. So how am I supposed to test this? This was a real application I used to work on. The 404 page looked like this one day. And it was because we had moved a CSS file, but of course, no one looked at the 404 page in order to test it. And so everything was just kind of, no style sheets and just missing. So then we fixed it, and we launched a fix for it, and the fix looked like this. And of course, we had missed QAing it on mobile, and we hadn't realized we had some weird z-index bug. And then how do you test if something is just missing? The button has disappeared, or the text has disappeared, or something is literally just not there. Are you supposed to remember that it was supposed to be there? Are you supposed to know that you're in the right context to sort of evaluate if it should have been there or not? Visual testing is also about what's not there or what was there before and how your visuals have been changing. And then kind of this. So this is like a sort of contrived example. This is a pizza app that's called the Angular Pizza Creator. And what happens if our pizza has turned green? So if I had a whole bunch of functional tests that tested this, I probably wouldn't catch this, right? Like the pizza is still getting created correctly. I can still buy it in the application, but I think this is a poor customer experience, right? Like when nobody's going to want to buy this green pizza. So how are we supposed to test these kinds of changes? How are we supposed to catch these kinds of regressions? And that's the underlying question of visual testing. So let's take a functional testing approach to it. Can I just use my functional testing suite? I've built up this whole like Selenium or Cypress suite. We've invested in CI. We're very like test-driven team. How do I then take that and sort of move it into to catching these kinds of changes? So I've got this like page, it's got a button on it and the button is missing. Let's go with that kind of case. So traditionally as an engineer, I'd want to write a regression test for this. I'd want to write like a functional test for this. So I've got some sort of, BDD style test for it. It says we're visiting the page, we're typing something into the box, we click submit. And then we have some expectations about what the next state is. So what am I supposed to do to this test to make it a visual test, let's say? Am I supposed to assert that there's a class applied to that button, that there's like a CSS computed style, or maybe that the exact color that I'm looking for is equal to something else? Maybe I do something like this, which is expect that it actually has a class applied to it. And there's an actual problem here, right? Which is that this doesn't actually visually test anything, right? This tests that there is a class applied to it, but what if that class is overwritten, or what if that class is not available on that page or in that component? So this is sort of an abstraction of visual testing. It's an attempt to do visual testing, but it actually doesn't actually check something visually from the user's perspective of how a user actually sees and interacts with your application. But I've seen this happen. I've done it myself. Everyone kind of starts here. We assume that we can sort of shimmy this stuff into our functional testing suites. And what happens is we start creating stuff like this, where you end up creating a test where it does not have a class of pinned, like this thing is not applied to it. Or for example, you just keep going and going, copying and paste this. This becomes like a testing culture way that the team operates. And then you have things that aren't applied, or checking that things don't exist on the page, or checking that they have a certain CSS property. And I like to sort of extrapolate this to its logical conclusion, which is if you're testing for all the things that don't exist on the page, there's an infinite number of those things, right? And if your team gets used to kind of trying to test this way, you end up copying and pasting and building this sort of testing culture. And this is from an example from a real application, and it just gets unwieldy super quickly, right? You end up creating this super fragile, very brittle test suite, where now I, as a developer, I just have a huge amount of fear, where a test suite should be giving me a lot of confidence, right? I can't go rename this component. I can't move a layout without severely breaking this test for no reason, right? It gets harder and slower to create new features or to change the features that we have. And to my point from a minute ago, we're not actually testing anything visually, right? These are not actually doing visual tests. So visual testing is kind of a new, better way of doing that, right? And the separation here is that basically functional testing tests that applications are behaving correctly, whereas visual testing tests that things look correct, that they are looking correct. These have two very sort of different paths, right? In functional testing, we think of them as pass-fail. We think of them as like, okay, they're passing or they're not, they're green or they're red. In visual testing, look correct is much more subjective, right? It's much more up to the observer. It's up to the designer. It's up to the developer to say, this is correct. This is what we visually intended, or this is not. And this is a difference in design, or this is an actual visual bug. So it kind of, it actually sort of separates itself even further there. And when we say look correct, we also mean a much more in-depth version than what you might think of at the surface. We mean this across browsers. We mean this across responsive widths. Does it look correct for all the components of your application, for the components in the context of the full pages that they're in, or in the context of being inside of other components? Does the design itself actually reflect the design that you want and the brand and the style that you want to represent to your users? If you have a design system for many products, does that design system remain consistent? And are you able to not have any sort of brand slippage in the design system over time? And then the key point here is the actual over time piece. Like, how are my visuals changing in my application over time? This is much more dynamic of a testing problem than pass-fail functional tests. Like, did I click this button? Did it work, right? You can see that this has a lot of human subjectivity in it, as well as a lot of opportunities for automation. So I like to sort of separate these and say that the main benefits of visual testing is that it protects against visual regressions and bugs across browsers and responsive widths. And the key thing that it's trying to do is to give us full confidence in every visual change at every step in our workflows. The way that this fits into your classic sort of testing methodologies that you might have right now is kind of this. This is a very simplistic kind of view, but I like how this sort of lays it out. So we've got, like, we're all doing kind of manual testing. Obviously, we're going to be clicking on things. Even our developers are going to be like testing the features that they're building. And then we're going to be automating those things into functional tests, right? We're going to have hopefully a nice functional testing suite that we've invested in that gives us a lot of confidence on every release. In manual testing, we are almost entirely human dependent, right? It's a manual for a reason. And in functional testing, we are almost 100% automated, right? We're trying to get everything to be explicitly pass-fail and totally automated. Visual testing is a new category of testing that has some interesting overlap between these two worlds. In the manual testing world, we are still involving humans in visual testing, right? We're still going to be saying this design is correct, this is what I intended, or this is not. But also we want to automate as much as possible on the functional testing side of things. We want to bring things into our visual testing products or into our review process for visual changes in an automated way. I don't want to have to like figure out as a person what changed on that page. I just want to review what the changes were that go through. So we kind of think of visual testing as its own space, its own category with nice overlaps with what we're doing currently in manual testing and in functional testing. So this is what we do at Percy. We are a visual testing and review platform. And I'm going to kind of go through some examples of what that means and give you some in-depth sort of demo of actually how that looks too. So we help you identify the visual changes that are actually going out as part of each of your commits and each of your changes. And visual testing usually breaks down into two main processes, visual diffs and visual reviews. So what is a visual diff? You may have seen these before. It basically is, what is the difference between these two things? But not as a human looking at this, but like computationally, what is the difference between these two things? And that might be something like this, right? This is a strictly single pixel by single pixel diff of these two images. And it tells you exactly which pixels have changed between these two states. And you can kind of see it tells me that not only these links have been added, but also that the drop-down shadow has been extended through the bottom of this diff. So in the strictest sense, you have to learn how to read visual diffs in the same way that you've learned how to read a code diff and kind of understand how it works, because these can get also kind of complex. And then on the visual review side of things, this is the actual part about how it integrates into your day-to-day workflow. So in Percy, what happens is you make a pull request like you would normally in GitHub or other SCM providers, and then you review and approve the visual diffs, and then you see that is actually reflected in your PR process, and you can merge the pull requests. And we're going to go through a more in-depth demo here in a second. So this overall, you can think of visual testing as fitting in great with web applications, with components, component libraries, end-to-end testing frameworks like Selenium, Cypress, and others, and even things that you might not have a test suite for, like might not traditionally be writing a functional test suite for. You can just take your static site and do visual testing on it and understand the impact of any change across your whole static site in a way that you wouldn't have been able to before. Really anything that's visual, you can test in visual testing frameworks. Okay, so that's a lot of words. What does that actually look like in practice? So I'm going to get into a demo here and sort of show you what does Percy actually look like and how does the workflow actually work live. So I've got this change in GitHub here. It's in this sort of very basic dashboard application. We're about to change the sign up button style. And let's say that I send this over to somebody on my team for a review. So they might come into this files change list and they might look at what's going on here. And I can tell that this is a CSS change. We're changing some style from this to this, and there's some compiled CSS changes here. I can probably say that this looks like it's the correct code, but I have no idea what impact this is going to have on my actual real application, right? So usually the process that we see teams do right now to cover this is they'll edit this description and they'll say, here's my before screenshot and here's my after screenshot, and this is what I'm changing in this application or in this PR. Obviously, that's a big reason why bugs still get into production, is because these screenshots get out of date. They don't test things across lots of browsers and lots of different states of your application. It's really just a quick sort of check that we use. So the way that Percy fits into this is we actually fit right alongside your existing functional testing suites to provide visual testing. So the existing functional testing suite here, any sort of CI service that you might have that's saying, yes, pass, fail, this thing, thumbs up, functionally everything's ready to go. But then Percy catches it and says, hey, there are 12 visual changes that need review as part of this PR change. And I can, right from GitHub, click on details and go to the Percy dashboard for what this change is. And I can go through and review these visual changes. So let's do that. So there are 12 visual changes that are in this PR. On the left-hand side here, this is the baseline from master. And then on the right-hand side, these are the changes from the PR that I'm making right now. And I can see this highlighted visual diff over the right-hand side here, and I can just click it to see the original or the new source underneath it. And just using this visual diff, I can compare and say, oh, I'm changing the sign in button that I expected to change, but also for some reason that CSS change is affecting this SVG logo as well. Maybe that's intentional, maybe it's not. Maybe this is a bug, maybe this is an intentional design shift. So it's up to me now at this point in the visual review to say, yes, that is correct, or no, that is actually unintentional. And I can do this very quickly without having to pull down a branch or boot up a local development environment or get the application into the right data state that I cared about or be logged in as the right person or any of those kinds of things. Just go right straight from the code to a visual review process and back. And I should be able to do this quickly across lots of different responsive widths and lots of different browsers and lots of different states of my application. So for example, I can take this, we're testing the validation state. So we're actually testing like an error state of this page to make sure it visually looks correct. And I can say, what does that look like at 375px? And here it is. And these are the visual changes that are going out at 375px. So I can catch if there's a mobile responsive CSS bug that we have without having to dig through it and actually test this in a responsive way. I can even test the error pages of the application, that 404 page that I talked about earlier. And then we can even test very complex versions of states of our application where, for example, in these states, I'm logged in as some user and I'm in some specific data state and I have a lot of objects associated with my user. This is something that would traditionally be very hard to do visual testing on, but Percy is actually very tailored for fitting into these very complex web application sort of states. I can even see that the logo change has sort of propagated itself to this part in the application as well. And also I'm having a weird side effect here where the checkbox background color of this checkbox is changing from green to blue. Maybe something that a designer would catch if they were looking at this page, but probably not something that a developer would even notice going through this if they even got to this page in sort of manual testing to look at it. And some other components are changing as well. Okay, so let's actually do the visual review. So I've looked at these, I've decided, okay, this one's actually wrong, so I can request changes on this particular change. And I can say, hey, Tim on my team, can you look at this? I don't think the logo is supposed to change. And then we can kind of have a conversation and go back and forth and figure out what is the right state of this actual component. And we can have a conversation here. And then once I'm ready with this, I can say, okay, yep, actually we're right. This is a correct intentional change. I'll approve this particular change. And then what will happen is once I'm happy with all of the changes here, all I have to do is hit approve up here in the top right. And that goes through and marks all of the changes as approved, but also it goes and it marks the GitHub pull request status as green. So we've done our first visual review together, right? We've actually completed a visual review process. And this is something that you can do tens of times a day across hundreds or even thousands of pages. And Percy will make it efficient for you to review all the visual changes across multiple different browsers and responsive widths. So you can have full confidence to know exactly what visual changes are actually getting pushed out from this PR. So that's kind of visual testing in a nutshell. Like what does it actually do? What does it look like? How does Percy sort of go about that from the front end perspective? Let's talk a little bit about how we actually integrate in. So you may have a CI setup right now where you have lots of different functional testing suites. And we actually have lots of different ways of integrating into those. So we have Percy script, which is like a very easy way to get started with visual testing. If you've used Chrome Puppeteer, it's actually like a lightweight wrapper around Chrome Puppeteer, lets you just write some very simple sort of tests and then go through and actually run those in a CI environment if you don't have these kind of existing test suites. So that's a good way to get started. Other things you may have already is like Cypress or Capybara tests for Rails applications and many, many more, right? So Storybook for components or Ember apps, Selenium, Puppeteer, et cetera, et cetera. So you should be able to integrate Percy into any of your existing web application testing suites. This kind of at a high level is like sort of wrapped up to web applications, components and component libraries, end-to-end testing frameworks, static sites. And we also have the ability to build your own SDK in case you have maybe your own custom JavaScript framework, or you have some internal testing system that you've used, we have an underlying core SDK that's part of everything called Percy Agent, which you can build your own SDKs on top of, and it takes care of all of the magic of actually collecting the things that get sent up to Percy correctly. So let's take a little deep dive into how does Percy work under the hood. This is going to sort of show you some of the secrets about how Percy works in order to sort of show you what we've optimized for in terms of like performance and making sure that this really can fit into day-to-day workflows. It does go kind of deep, not too deep, but kind of deep pretty quickly, so I'll go a little bit slow here. So the easiest, every integration in Percy basically comes down to this in your CI suite or in your SDKs. Usually it's just a single line that says, Percy snapshot, here's my home page. And then you give it the sort of name that it tells it, Percy, what is the unique state that you're looking at. So this might be the home page, or it might be the dashboard page with the dropdown clicked, something that sort of uniquely identifies this state of this page. And then underneath that in your CI environment, you've got your test runner running, and that actually sends these snapshots over to a local agent process that's running in your CI environment. And then Percy agent takes care of actually sending up the snapshots to Percy itself. So a question that we get often is what is actually sent up from the Percy agent to Percy itself? Most people assume that the thing that's actually getting sent up here is actually an image. If we were to send up images from the CI environment, we'd have a lot of different problems. The images, the screenshots need to be full pages. They're extremely computationally expensive to create. They can take 20, 30, 40 seconds to take a full page screenshot. They're extremely indeterminate inside of your CI environment. It might be a random test browser that you're just using in CI provider's setup, or it might be an old test browser that doesn't actually have full testing capabilities, or like a headless browser. It might not be, there might not be any browser actually running. You might just be sending up static pages. So what we actually send up, we also send out, from Percy, we send out the source code integrations that integrate on this piece. So the actual thing that we actually send up here is a DOM snapshot. And this is a sort of core architectural piece of Percy where we send up the snapshot of the HTML that your page has actually, that your test suite has actually created, and the assets that go along with it, like the images or the style sheets. And we actually SHA-256 fingerprint these assets as we're sending them up. So that means that in the end, we only ever upload the assets once. So if you send us an image and you try to send us an image again, we won't need to upload it the second time. Same with all of the other assets. The sharp-eyed among you may notice that this is much lighter weight than images, right? What we actually send up here is basically just text and images and assets, so that we can actually reconstruct the state of the page and the components that you're sending us up on Percy's side in a controlled browser rendering environment. So these DOM snapshots are then they're heavily parallelized and sent into our visual rendering infrastructure, which does things like run 100 of them at the same time, or control for the fonts of the system, so that if we have upgraded the underlying OS, that the fonts are remaining the same and you won't get visual differences from font changes. We'll also handle things like single pixel anti-aliasing artifacts that might happen from just browsers optimizing for rendering SVGs or borders. We also enable this to do this at high scale, so that we can actually request Google Fonts tens of thousands of times in a second, and not actually be DDoSing servers on the internet that we might be requesting so many of these assets from. So there's a lot of optimizations that we're able to do with this architecture that let us send up these lightweight DOM snapshots and then take over rendering for them in a very controlled environment, so that we can control all the things about how those things are rendered. For example, other things that we do in this is freeze animations. So you may have like an animated GIF on a page or a CSS animation. those things are nice when you're viewing the page in a realistic way, but they're often going to cause false positive visual diffs, right, when the animation changes. So a lot of Percy's optimizations internally are around actually freezing the states of the things that we can to get them into a stable place for visual testing so that we can create stable visual diffs. So it's kind of a quick deep dive into how Percy works underneath. We have a sort of a sort of general wrap up here is to say that like visual testing is a new way to help you automatically detect and review these visual changes before they're deployed to users. And the ultimate goal of this is that we can efficiently and effectively help you get confidence in every change. So it's not about, you know, pass fail. It's not about just getting the exact answer about it. It's about facilitating your review workflows, like making sure that you can actually have that confidence at the day-to-day PR level of every visual change that you're launching, and really start automating how those how that confidence is available to us. I wanted to go through a couple more interesting use cases at the end here, so you can start thinking about how ways in which visual testing might go beyond what you think it can do today. So obviously catching visual regressions, this is the big case, right? We all want to stop visual bugs from going out to our users. We don't want them, don't want to be testing on our users in this way. So catching visual bugs, that's like core idea number one. But also those tests that I showed you earlier, if you think about that, those entire blocks of code can be replaced by just a single line that says Percy snapshot. And that lets you write smaller, more effective tests, which are actually testing the thing that you care about, right? They're actually testing the visual side of the application versus testing, you know, sort of the abstractions or like specific classes, and creating these really brittle and fragile tests. So what we're trying to do is really like, you know, create a nice connection point between the existing test suites that you have and the way that you might be able to do those visual reviews. So hopefully this lets you write much more smaller and more effective, more maintainable test suites. I don't know, can I use the raise your hand feature? Raise your hand if you've ever had like fear about deleting CSS. Like if you've ever not wanted to delete a CSS file or a CSS line because you have no idea where it's actually used in your application. Okay, the hands are going up, 40, 50, 60, right? This is a huge problem. We all have terrifying fear about deleting CSS. It's like something we never want to do. CSS is like this append-only file system. So go add visual tests to your top 50 pages that you care about, top 50 states that you care about in your application. Then delete the CSS file and see what happens. If nothing changes, then probably you're fine, right? You've got some confidence to know that you're not actually breaking something that you didn't intend to, and that deleting that CSS is going to be fine. So we actually have done this in Percy multiple times because we use Percy for our own development efforts. We have changed CSS frameworks 2 times and had almost no visual regressions in the entire change. Or we've deleted hundreds or thousands of lines of CSS, and we've known exactly what visual impact that would have on our application. This is a huge efficiency boost to our day-to-day work, right? Because we don't have to manually check these things or worry about them. We just know, we're just able to just know exactly what we're changing every single time. Another interesting use case that you may not think of is just making dependency upgrades safe, right? We've got these really complex JavaScript ecosystems now where we have thousands of dependencies, and we have things like Dependabot and others that can automatically upgrade your dependencies. Sometimes those automatic upgrades, or any dependency upgrade, even if you're doing it manually yourself, will break the visual side of your application, right? If you've got a power select box and you do an upgrade to the power select component, possibly it's going to break the integration or the visual side of that component. So we actually have this very interesting setup for ourselves where we have Percy, the front-end web application, and we have Dependabot. And so we get automatic PRs created with dependency upgrades and automatic checks of all the visual changes. So we can click merge on dependency upgrades and know with confidence that they are not going to break anything in the application visually or functionally. That's a huge change to our ability to actually iterate and keep our applications up to date safely without having to worry about the overhead of these dependency upgrade changes. So you can actually pair, Dependabot, Greenkeeper, these automated dependency upgrade systems with visual testing, and then all of a sudden you have basically 100% confidence, very, very high confidence that all of the changes that are going out for your dependency upgrades are actually safe, and they've been automated by robots for you. So you're able to immediately go from a robot, upgrading your dependencies to a robot checking them for visual changes and then just merging the PRs. And then obviously testing visualizations. This is something like if you've written D3 animations or visualizations at all, you know that there's basically no way to test them. You can test the inputs of the system and you can test the outputs of the system, but that doesn't actually check what visually is changing on that visualization. So just slap a Percy snapshot on it and all of a sudden you have visual tests for any visualizations you have in your application. Really easy way to test things we weren't able to test before. And then ultimately hopefully the use case here is that we actually are able to reach continuous deployment more safely and more efficiently and effectively in our software development teams, right? It's a sort of the missing link in the continuous deployment pipeline is the ability to check visual changes and know that we're deploying them with confidence. We can have all of these checks along the way. We can have unit tests, we can have integration tests and end-to-end tests. We can have smoke tests for the actual deployments and tests of the things in production. And then we still don't have confidence that the visual changes that we're launching are going to actually be what we intend. So Percy and visual testing is kind of the missing link in this chain of getting us all to continuous deployment. I wanted to move into Q&A so we can have some time for that. Thank you. Hopefully that gives you a deep overview of kind of visual testing at its core and the best practices and then sort of benefits of it.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. That was a great overview of Percy and all the things that we can do with the Percy platform. Awesome. We have a lot of questions, so I'm glad we got enough time. All right. So bunch of questions around what Percy works on or works with. So I'm going to go through those first. So one is, can I use Percy with GitHub Enterprise?
Yeah, good question. You can use Percy with GitHub Enterprise. It comes with our enterprise accounts, and we have the ability to sort of get through, do any of the sort of security reviews with your teams. And if it's behind a firewall, those kinds of things, we can handle that. There's a bit of a key exchange that has to happen there. So that definitely is part of the sort of enterprise setup. But yes, we do support it for sure.
Okay, great. A question around the support for different browsers and devices. So question around, will Percy support all the different browsers and devices available on the BrowserStack platform?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So Percy is a brand new integration into BrowserStack, right? We sort of bring our visual testing infrastructure along with us as part of this. But obviously, that's a huge benefit of this acquisition is that we're going to be able to rely on our teams integrating and our infrastructures integrating so that we can use BrowserStack powered browsers underneath Percy as well. So you can definitely look forward to a sort of expanded browser testing platform in Percy and with more and more BrowserStack browsers there. A lot of the benefits too there, I would say, is that we actually do a lot of these automatic upgrades for you. And BrowserStack is very much on top of making sure the latest browsers are always available in the ecosystem for testing. So Percy will be able to rely on that sort of infrastructure changes as well for us to keep our automatic upgrades going as well. So yeah, definitely look forward to more things in the future and kind of watch this space on things related to how the acquisition and BrowserStack will work together.
Awesome. All right, question around whether Percy will at some point be available for mobile apps.
Yes, great question. So that's kind of a continuation of the one before. Obviously, BrowserStack has a huge amount of ecosystem around testing native mobile applications. You can't really do this in Percy right now, but we're looking forward to the future of being able to do that with BrowserStack's infrastructure as well.
Awesome. All right. Questions around, can we use Percy? A couple of people asked this, can we use Percy on PDF files or can we just use it on web pages?
That's a great question. We actually have a handful of customers who have tested with PDFs. We don't support native PDF format, but often we find that the customers who have this question have an HTML endpoint that's actually can generate the source for the PDF, and then it's actually pulled into a PDF by basically printing to PDF in their systems. So if you have that original source HTML sort of endpoint for how your PDFs are generated, we can test that. We can't test currently the native PDF format.
All right. A couple of people asked this question: Is Percy similar to snapshot testing with Jest?
Oh, I love these questions. Okay, so I have actually a pretty strong contention that no, they are absolutely totally different things. If you've used just snapshots before, you may actually be very familiar with how frustrating they are in terms of what they actually give you. And my contention is they don't actually give you very much. They record a snapshot of the layout, not even the layout, they record a snapshot of the HTML that is created by that component in a particular state. And then they force you personally to look at the HTML diff of the compiled HTML and figure out what has changed between them. So if you remember early in my talk when I was kind of talking about functional testing and adding assertions for specific CSS classes or other things, I would say it's very much in that realm. That doesn't actually test anything visually. It might give you some confidence if you're really micromanaging this a ton. It might give you some confidence in the layout or the HTML changes to flag those before they go out. But it gives you zero confidence in the actual visual user visible aspects of changes. So no, Percy snapshots are very, very different than just snapshots. And I would say that visual testing, I wouldn't even classify just snapshots as visual testing at all.
Awesome. A couple of questions around integrations on frameworks. So one is, does Percy support WebDriver IO as a test framework?
Yeah, we do. We do support WebDriver IO. There's a documentation page on how to integrate it in with WebDriver IO. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then a couple of questions around, one is around, will the Percy sort of results, screenshots be integrated with the BrowserStack API? And also, will Percy work with tool like TestRail?
With tools like what?
TestRail.
Oh yeah, okay. So we kind of answered before, there will be additional integrations with Percy inside of BrowserStack over time. I would be curious to hear more about what kind of integration you're looking for with the actual API that you're talking about there. So if maybe the original poster can give us a little bit more info on that, that'd be interesting. But yeah, we do expect to sort of integrate more and more pieces of these over time and find some interesting overlaps between, for example, people using Automate and people using Percy, and how can we make those two work nicely and cohesively together. You can use them independently right now. You can actually have Percy tests be testing something that's running on Automate, even though the browsers underneath are not going to be BrowserStack browsers at the moment. They're Percy's acquired sort of browser infrastructure. But yeah, you can actually use the same sort of the same things to get the functional confidence and the visual confidence with Percy and Automate right now.
All right, great. I think there are a couple of questions around security. What is the security privacy of the snapshots? How do I make sure that my snapshots are private and will not be exposed?
Yeah, great. So Percy, at its core, we operate at your testing level, right? So we don't ever receive production PII or like your production pages, any of those kinds of things. We're actually, if you're integrating us into your testing suites, you're only using mock data, you're only using fake users, fake data, all of that kind of thing. So in terms of the security review of those kinds of things, often it's quite simple because we're not receiving any kind of production data. We're just receiving this kind of mock test layer of the integration. And then in terms of other security pieces, yeah, your organization that you create in Percy and BrowserStack are completely segmented from other organizations. So only the people that you give access to can see those screenshots and can see that access. We do have the ability for open source applications to make their projects public. So you can actually make your projects public and share your Percy diffs with other people, but that's something that you have to enable on your side. So yeah, we take that very seriously.
Awesome. All right, a lot of questions about functionality. Okay, lots of questions around dynamic data and how do I handle like if my website has a lot of dynamic information which keeps changing, right? So how would you deal with that kind of situation with Percy?
Yeah, great questions. So this is going to be one of the first things that you're going to probably start hitting when you get started with visual testing is in the same way that once you got started with like unit testing or functional testing, there's probably some massaging of your test suite that you had to do to make sure that data is in the right formats that you wanted to test, or that things are stable in certain ways and you don't have literally flaky unit tests. We find that in visual testing, there's kind of two main components of things that can change on your websites that you want to think about how they're going to be represented in visual changes. One of them is time, and the other one is dynamic data. I actually have, let's see. Yeah, actually, can I share my screen one more time in order to actually show this sort of best practice around timing and taking over sort of control of these. Narain, I don't know if you're there, and I can screen share quickly here. Great. So for data and for time, let's go to time first. Often we find that people are using Moment.js for this, and Moment has an ability to actually freeze time in your test suites quite simply. So you can just say, here's the time baseline that we want to use in our test suites. I find that this removes 50 to 60% of any of the sort of changes that might happen in these test suites, because a lot of them are going to be related to the time showed a different date, or showed a different month, or showed a different like progress bar based on the timing of how long that thing ran, or those kinds of things. A lot of the visual things we're doing on websites are time dependent. This is quite easy nowadays to actually freeze time in your test suites. And then for deterministic data, often people are using like Faker.js to generate random seed data for their test suites and for their mock data for their tests. It's very easy to make Faker still produce fake data, but not create it randomly by doing a Faker seed setup in your test suites. So you can just run Faker seed 1, 2, 3, give it sort of a stable seed number. And then your test suites will actually generate test data, fake data deterministically. And with these two things, we find that most people are able to stabilize their test suites for visual testing quite easily. So given those two things, then there's this sort of escape hatch, like, okay, we have this area of the page we always know is going to be different. We know it's going to flag in Percy every single time because it's always going to change. How do I deal with that? This is very similar to the sort of ignore region kind of feature in other questions that I've seen here too. So how you do that in Percy is we have this thing called Percy specific CSS. It's actually quite easy. All you have to do is do media only Percy. And this allows you to take full control of Percy's rendering environment. So this CSS will only be applied when these screenshots are actually rendered in Percy. And that allows you to say, this region is, this div can be hidden, or this div can be blocked out, or make sure that I'm loading this thing in this area when I'm doing visual tests. So you should be able to do anything here that you want to actually be able to hide regions or stabilize any piece of your infrastructure or any piece of your snapshots that you need to. So we find that these three things combined often provide the kind of stability that people are looking for in their visual tests.
Awesome, great. I think a couple of questions around integrations again. Does Percy work with someone who has an on-prem Azure DevOps server, which is not on a publicly facing network?
Yes, good question. So there's kind of, I guess, two sort of aspects there. We can definitely test anything that is behind, like even a local development server or in CI, anything like that. Those things get posted up to Percy and then rendered. But Percy itself is a cloud-only SaaS service, so we don't support like on-prem deployments of Percy itself. But if you're able to sort of push anything to the internet in the same way that for Browser Stack, then we support that, and we support like local testing of local host kind of sites.
Awesome. Okay. I think you answered some of
Great.
these questions. There is one around, okay, so since Percy is pixel to pixel, how would you handle differences in rendering across operating systems like font size and style, on the same page?
Yeah, good question. So it is pixel to pixel, but we also have done a lot of customizations of that to make sure that that pixel to pixel comparison and diffing is as stable as it can be over time, with a lot of sort of smart diffing logic in there. For fonts and other pieces across different systems, hopefully those are actually just stable, right? So there's no sort of interaction there with the fact that they're pixel by pixel. They are the same font every time. And if you change that font, you'll probably want to know that that font has changed between the two states. We do a lot of sort of customizations in our environment for making sure that fonts are actually loaded correctly and weighted for correctly on pages, because fonts are super complex. They're often loaded asynchronously. They're very highly optimized on the web platform to make sure that the pages can load and then the fonts can load. So Percy does quite a few things there to make sure that the fonts are actually, that you've requested, any sort of web fonts and those kinds of things are actually supported and weighted for correctly.
Great. All right, a lot more questions. Let's try to see if we can get through some of them quickly. Okay.
There's another font question around domain-based allow lists. Like, do you support third-party font services that require domain-based allow lists? We definitely do. There's a doc page on this. You just have to whitelist the Percy rendering domain, and then that will totally work as well as your normal domain lists work. So just check out the docs on that one.
Cool. I think a couple of people asked about configurable breakpoints for snapshots.
Mm-hmm. Yep, all the breakpoints that I showed in the demo are fully configurable. You can say, we care about this kind of breakpoint size and this tablet size and this desktop size. And you can configure up to, I think, 10 different breakpoint sizes. So there's sort of any amount of configuration you want to do on breakpoints, we allow.
Okay. All right. Question around, okay, can we detect things like mouse over or hover states on visual elements?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we actually do a lot of work to make sure that the mouse is not interacting with your page while we're taking visual screenshots, because we don't want the hover states to cause false positives. But often you're able to, if you can render, for example, a component in a hover state, then we are able to test those kinds of things. If you're able to say, this is the hover state for this component, and it renders like that, then we can take snapshots of that. Some of those are a little bit more complex, and if you're hovering over a state of a button on your CI suite, we may not capture that as the snapshot gets sent up, because the snapshot doesn't represent things that are happening in the browser that are outside of the DOM. So for some of those things we do, for some of those things we don't. It depends on your specific use case and sort of technical setup.
Sure. I think, Mike, there are a couple of questions around people or folks who are just, let's say, starting the process of building their web app, so they don't have a baseline, right? Is it possible to sort of take like a, design element and just compare it with like versions of your website as you're building it out?
Yeah, we have had people do that before with varying degrees of success. I would say Percy is built to actually test your real applications and your real designs, and it's very easy to establish a baseline for them. So just get your first tests in there, get it in master, and then all of a sudden you have these first 10 snapshots, and you're on your way to having the baseline and having it available for the next PR. I think it's quite easy to get the baseline set up in Percy, so don't let that be the stopper for you getting in there. In terms of like design comparison, you can do that. You can upload images as your baseline and then sort of design to that. We actually had a teacher do that once for his class, where the baseline was set by him as the teacher with images that he had rendered, and then the class had to design an HTML page and CSS that would actually match up to that thing. So it is possible, but I would say that the best case scenario for your use of Percy is we don't want to be necessarily in that part of the design process. We want to be one step later, which is actually testing the real application and giving you an iteration over the baseline from your real apps. So I would highly suggest that you work at that layer.
Awesome. I think some questions around Percy pricing and how it's going to work since the acquisition and sort of the combination of BrowserStack and Percy.
Yeah, absolutely. So we still have a free plan. BrowserStack's been very supportive of making sure that developers have very easy access to get started with visual testing. And just a couple of months ago, we even buffed our free plan, and I think like doubled the size of how much it has, and it has unlimited users, all that kind of stuff. So please go check out the free plan on browserstack.com/Percy and just get started today. Get it using and get using it, and hopefully that just provides you with a nice like setup for some simple tests. Then the pricing is available on browserstack.com/pricing, and it basically scales with the usage. So if you have a 25,000 snapshots, and that's kind of where you're going to land, that's the first pricing point, all the way up to hundreds of thousands or even millions of snapshots per month in our enterprise plans. So Percy's truly built scale in that way and make sure that we can support any team size and any sort of like speed of iteration.
Awesome. Great. Well, I think we're out of time, Mike. Thank you for taking the time to walk us through Percy and for answering all those questions. I think for everyone attending and asking questions, we are documenting everything, and we will make sure that we get those answered and reply back to you. All right. Thanks again, Mike.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good luck with the rest of the presentations, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you.